Hello and welcome to the second in our series of webinars on end-to-end supply information management or SIM strategy. Today's topic is implementing a SIM solution, what to do, what to look out for, and it follows from our previous session, building the business case. We will cover areas such as how to overcome alignment issues, the resources needed from IT, ensuring that all stakeholders have been identified and are on board for the implementation journey, and how to ensure that you don't miss anything that will cause issues further down the line. We'll also start thinking about data. What are the practical steps to avoid data delays or failures? For this session, I'm delighted to welcome Craig Penk, Director at Baker Hughes, to discuss this in more detail. So welcome, Craig, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Duncan. Pleasure to be here.
So I'm going to dive straight in here and first of all ask, would you mind giving us a bit of an overview of your experience and all of the things that have led you to this point to date?
Absolutely. So I started my career at Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan in a finance role, actually supporting materials planning and logistics. I did customs compliance. And at some point very early in my career, I was given a choice to either join the finance program or materials planning and logistics. So I ended up going that direction. And for the next 5 years, I was on a bunch of rotational programs, basically gaining experience at every one of the service offerings within supply chain. Everything from production to scheduling, supervision on the shop floor, procurement, contracts, network optimization, engineering. So at the point where Ford Motor Company eventually spun off their internal manufacturing company, Visteon, since I had this cross-functional exposure, I was selected to be on our team that selected and implemented our new ERP system, right? So we had to develop new systems and processes to support non-Ford customers as we became a true supplier, a sales organization. So that's how I ended up getting introduced to SAP and big projects and global templates and plant launches, right? So I spent many years traveling all over the world, launching our manufacturing templates and plants for Visteon, which was an enterprise of Ford and then an independent company. So I'd hit out in China for a while where things were still good when the United States and automotive was imploding. And when I returned to Detroit, it was pretty bleak. And I decided that it's probably a good opportunity to change not only industries, but geography, right? To get a little bit better weather, because I'd spent a lot of time in Spain and Thailand, so a little more tropical. So that brought me to oil and gas, and it was a huge change. The biggest one was that supply chain wasn't always necessarily perceived to be a competitive advantage, and complex services were a huge part of the spend profile, not something that was the case in automotive. So it was a big adjustment, and really a lot of the work was about being a salesman as well and trying to encourage people to do things that they inherently didn't want to do, right? Around integration, automation, things like ERS. You'd be amazed at how little people in oil and gas were doing that. In automotive, it was the only way we paid bills because it was cheap, right? So margin business. So within the oil and gas industry, I'm probably equally. I've been within upstream oil and gas and service companies. Most recently at Baker Hughes, doing business transformation.
Yes, so your current role, as you mentioned at the end there, what are your key activities here?
Well, in my current role, I'm the Director of Source to Pay Center of Excellence, and I'm functionally responsible for vendor registration and onboarding, HICS, the Ariba modules, reporting. We've got a very diverse landscape, so we have a common reporting group and tool, and supplier enablement, right, which is getting people onboarded on all these tools and interfacing on portals. So that's my current role. I've been doing a lot of that work in business transformation or digital transformation, right?
And now just thinking about Baker Hughes specifically then, from a technology perspective, obviously the context here is that Baker Hughes itself has been on a journey involving merging and transforming into a standalone company and so on. But how has this interplayed with the technical landscape?
Well, let's just say it's super complex, right? So I wasn't naive when I joined Baker Hughes a couple of years ago about how complex things were, but it's probably 50% more complex than I ever thought it would be. And you're right, a lot of it was because of the merger with GE, the partially or half-baked merger before that, or acquisition, and now the demerger with General Electric, right? So we have a very complex environment, 15 ERPs that I can think of. 4 of them are strategic, and they're SAP and Oracle for the most part. By the way, they're not designed consistently, even though they are the same product in many cases, right? Those are the big ERPs. We also had a bunch of other disparate systems that bolted on for specific functions with poor to no integration in many cases, right? And the environment that left us with was highly manual work environment accomplished with people and brute force. And our global landscape is huge. We operate in over 120 countries as well. So all of this provides a lot of complexity and change management. And one of the challenges that we've had, and I'll address it later, is because of this demerger with General Electric, we've also got a very accelerated timeline because there's financial penalties for not meeting those exit dates.
Of course. So in terms of implementation then, within such a complex scenario, I know that a key focus for Baker Hughes was what you refer to as organizational readiness. I'd love to unpack this theme a little bit. What does this mean in practice? How does an organization become ready for SIM?
Well, that's really kind of a tough question, right? I mean, you can say you could, do, quick reference guides or assess training, have hypercare, all of the things that people do. But, I'll start with, we did make some mistakes and we were constrained by that GE separation initiative and the accelerated timeline. And some of the things that hit us really hard and our lessons learned is that we had really not a meaningful master data cleanup in preparation for implementing some of these work streams. And that's just killing us over and over and over again. The team jokes that sometimes it's like we're fixing the airplane while we're flying it, right? In this manual environment where a lot of people were doing things either outsourced or, in internal groups that weren't necessarily aligned, we had kind of poor or suboptimal due diligence, right? It was very difficult to enforce governance and see who was doing what and rationalize that, right? And it was also tough because of the fact that our ERP systems, even the SAPs and the Oracles, did not look alike and were not configured the same way. So different people supported different systems as well as different functions, right? So that was difficult. And then we had conflicting priorities, of course, right? So to prepare for this, these initiatives and the Hicks initiative, we had to come to consensus with different product companies, different ERPs, different functions from legal, risk, sourcing, IT, DT, our own internal groups. So it was very complex, a lot of different opinions from different companies with different rationale for how and why they did things, making different products in different countries. So we had a series of workshops where we hashed out, where we could come to consensus and where we couldn't, and trying to document why we had to have differences, right? And working through that. So there was a lot of prep involved, but probably the most difficult thing was not having that master data cleanup exercise.
You mentioned there consensus and working with other teams, legal, risk, IT, and so on. So when you mention these points, I can't help but think there's a real people element to this as well. So With that in mind, I wanted to ask now about adoption strategy. What's involved in that when you've overcome the initial challenges that you mentioned and you're moving forward with SIM?
So, having the tool, it was half the battle, right? Because, like I mentioned, there are a lot of different business processes in different geographies, right? People who were based in Florence had a different, maybe governance path than people who were in the United States. Their support organization looked differently. I mean, we're talking about a matrix organization, right? So it was very, very difficult, but there was a lot of collaboration, a lot of workshops, a lot of participants, right, who spent hours and hours and hours designing what the solution would look like. And, each person had a different point of view or a different experience where they were coming from, but also we were looking at overline our corporate governance on top of that. So that's where legal comes in, or supplier risk, what we call ASP. So, which tools we're going to use. We had a bunch of RFPs as well, who we're going to integrate with to do compliance checks, right? Denied party. So all of that we had to reach consensus before we ever got to the build. And then as we went through the build, it was nice to have that community of super users who were involved in the process. We call them BPLs, and they would take the training and the design back to their communities. They were responsible for not only bringing design requests to the table, but also going and building consensus within their product companies and training the group of users, mostly sourcing, but also, like you say, legal or risk. So that's kind of how that process looked like. As we went through build and went live for each one of these product companies, it was a staggered launch. It didn't all happen at the same time. So we had a hypercare process where we had standing meetings for 2 weeks, in some case extended if there were challenges, where people had an open forum to address their problems so that they knew that they had somewhere to go other than a blind ticketing process. We also did have a ticketing process as well. But most importantly, having that staggered launch, we had a lot of lessons learned that came from the first group to go live, which was digital solutions, right? So we were able to address or make changes to how we were doing our cutovers and how we treated data and just the process and how many people were involved and the cadence and the meeting schedule. So yeah, we learned as we went along. Also, we have a very formalized steering and advisory process where we have meetings to address progress and then reporting and prioritization, right? It ensures that not only that we raise issues up through leadership, but also that we ensure that we raise consensus, because every one of these product companies is on the meeting, right? So if they don't like what they see from a prioritization standpoint, or if there's something that was missing, they have a forum to address that. So all the parts kind of fit together, if you will, and there's good collaboration, both vertically and horizontally.
You mentioned there that there were learnings along the way, and I guess that there are obstacles that come up that can't be foreseen sometimes. How do you ensure confidence is maintained whilst you're also learning along the way? I guess there's an element of balance that needs to be struck.
So that's a really good point, right? Two things that I told management, and even before I started, was look, things are never going to be perfect. Our ability to resource for a stabilization, especially in light of our accelerated time frame, right? We had to plan on having the resources available to address gaps or problems, right? So that was something that needed to be in place, but also the ability to pivot, right? And that's what's nice about being in a low-code environment, is to be able to address these mistakes or gaps or errors as we find them without significantly impacting the business, right? So, having been in launches for, I don't know, 27 years now, you always have problems, right? No matter how hard and long you prepare. And, the mere fact that we had an accelerated time frame, I expected to, have more problems than if we had 2 years to clean our master data and, increase our due diligence and exposure and testing, right? All of these things were really accelerated.
One of the key phrases that you touch upon there is resources. And of course, a project such as this requires resource, input, and support from across the organization. For instance, I'm thinking of IT support here as just one example. How do you make sure that the right resources are available at the right time and that everything can be kept on track?
Well, it's super difficult, right? Because we're in a global environment. So we've got, issues with, you know, different time zones and, you know, vacation schedules depending on where you are in the world, right? So, I'd like to say that, all of this comes together without a lot of orchestration, but, we do have a lot of meetings. Part of the goal is to make sure that everybody's heard. That's always the best way to make decisions, right? To reach consensus by talking it out. And I assure you, there's so many different opinions and priorities, cultural differences, even, right? And of course, as a leader of this process, trying to understand the subject matter, right? So, you're at a different company, it's got different history, different governance requirements for all these different product companies, a different perspective, right? So, how to bring the best strategic guidance while still being aware of what's going on at the desk level, right? So I'm a firm believer that for you to be able to make good strategic decisions, you need to know what's going on at the desk level, right? So, part of that is building trust and credibility with all of these different business units and people around the world, and then ensuring that they're heard so they can bring their best every day, right? Because there is a certain amount of fatigue as well of going through this process. It burns people out, right? So you have to make sure that culturally that you have an environment where everybody is respected and everyone's trusted, right? And credibility is our license to operate with our business stakeholders. So we need to ensure that we build that credibility and to have that cadence and consensus, which is why we do take the time to not only meet internally, but also externally to ensure that everybody feels that their voice is being heard.
Talking of being heard, gaining respect, ensuring credibility, building the right culture, again, all of these points rely on the people aspect of implementation. And I read with interest actually about the people leader guides that are a key part of this at Baker Hughes. What's the role of the people leader guides specifically? Is it communications or messaging or something else?
It is. So there's an expectation at Baker Hughes, right, that communication is key, and that we actually live our values. And I can assure you that my leadership certainly does. I mean, we're always taking on a lot of work and dealing with conflicting priorities, but leadership is serious about the values. So part of that is to have the consensus and the honesty at all levels of the organization, and to make tough decisions and be blunt and fail fast, and move on and pivot, right? Because that's one thing that's been pervasive for the last almost 2 years, is having to pivot over and over and over again, right? The PDCA cycle. So if something's not working, right, let's say it's broken and move on. And across all of our work streams, we do a lot of that.
So some of the audience here will be very much at the beginning of the whole process of implementation and adoption, which led me to wonder, if you were starting out all over again and could give advice based on your experiences, what advice would you like to have heard?
Ooh, Well, I mean, you've heard my message that's kind of been pervasive over and over again about the data. So I really, really wish that we had had the luxury of having a data project to clean up our master data, to look at the inconsistencies across our different ERPs and product companies for the configuration of our data points, right? How many what the length of a VAT registration ID is, or how we're using partner information. The other mistake that we made was around what our assumptions were for how to structure a master data, vendor master data. And it was noble what we're trying to accomplish by taking a look at the relationship rather than all of the granularity of the different countries and companies and sites and plants and all of that, and trying to leverage the relationship data across our different ERPs. And to a certain extent, that made sense, but also we learned we had a couple of unintended consequences, right? So one of them is valid bank accounts that exist for a vendor. Well, maybe you don't want to see every one of those bank accounts, because then you'll have to select one manually where in the past you didn't, right? Or just further develop your system to account for more granular maintenance. So that's something that was a lesson learned, right? Same thing with how we maintain commercial terms and conditions at the site level, right? So different product lines have different terms negotiated. We also have a huge factoring program in place, right? So suppliers may choose to participate in one place, not another, or we may be legally constrained by certain countries, like France, for example, where you can't go more than 60-day payment terms. So those were some of the lessons learned as well. And if we had more time to dig into these issues up front, it would have been less painful now, right, as we're making changes.
Right, so it sounds like that focus on detail, even in spite of any time pressure, remains absolutely key.
Yeah, absolutely, and especially in a highly complex environment, asking the right questions up front in the process, right? I think we were focused more on capturing what we had already built and enhancing the compliance and the automation around that. But we didn't necessarily ask all the right questions from the many 120 plus countries and geographies about strategically how should we do this.
Well, this leads nicely to the next section that I wanted to move on to, actually, which is aligning technology selection to the desired business outcomes. How do you ensure your technology selection delivers what you are looking for?
Well, I mean, having done this for a while now, I believe that all technology should be based on sound functional principles, right? And should be business case led. So when that doesn't happen, that's when you have challenges, right? When perhaps the project's led from a technical standpoint, then you're going to miss some of this, right? So if the project's business case led, you end up working through the technical problems, in the right direction. So that's some advice that I could give. But the other one, and it's also been across every one of the launches I've ever been involved in, is try not to build too much complexity on day one, because most people really discount change management and how difficult that can be and how complex it can be. And if you're able to transition to a new platform and build some adoption and not have too many problems, right? Well, that's your license to operate and further enhance, right? So take a look at change in an incremental manner. I mean, obviously we didn't have the luxury to fully do that because we had to lift and shift some of the current business processes that we had, and we also had to design around an Ariba work stream as well. So I could talk about those complexities for hours and certain gaps, and that would have to be coordinated across 3 different work streams, right? Ariba, our ERPs, and HICS, right? So that was difficult to balance, right? But if you can build on the fundamentals and get adoption, then go through the enhancements, right?
Definitely some great advice there. And talking about incremental changes, and also combined with perhaps some of the fatigue that can accompany change during implementation, how do you manage the expectations of all stakeholders while navigating that backdrop?
Well, yeah, there's definitely some of that, but unfortunately, the answer is through too many meetings. But in all seriousness, to know when to have a meeting that is about listening to people's opinions and reaching or reconciling those opinions and getting consensus and alignment, as compared to working sessions, right? So I found that sometimes the best way to solve problems is to get everybody on the meeting, especially in this post-COVID environment. It's easier to do since we're all remote and we've got Teams and other tools, and to actually work and hash out these issues one at a time, right? So two different types of meetings: one to reach consensus, another one to build, and that's how most of these things get done.
Understood. That makes sense. All right, next I wanted to shift gear slightly here and turn to outcomes now, perhaps in the context now of digital transformation. My first question on this topic is this: what are some of the top level business outcomes that you've seen?
Even with all of the challenges that we've had and all of the changes that we've had to make across our work streams, notwithstanding Hicks, we've experienced a big improvement for onboarding and extensions compared with our legacy system. So our legacy system, that averaged about 17 days, and we're at a little bit over half of that, maybe 9%. So, as much as we've had challenges, that's a really positive metric, right? We're doing better than we used to. And the other one is the improved not only governance that comes with having a tool like Hicks, but also the visibility to that governance and the controls. So very quickly after each one of our launches, we put together audit reports that go out monthly that takes a look at two levels of compliance, really. One is compliance to using Hicks, the tool, and if you didn't use it, rationalizing or articulating why you didn't. And the other one is compliance to process, right? So even if you didn't use the tool, did you follow the governance offline? And just to throw some numbers around that, for the last few months, we've been 100% compliant to governance, and about 97% compliant to using the tool. So that's been really positive as well. And in the last few years, we've had increased cases of attempted fraud, some successful, most of them unsuccessful, thankfully. But this tool helps to enforce that governance and mitigate fraudulent activity. Also, in the past, it wasn't always required to have vendor master details within your ERP to pay the supplier. That changed about 8 months ago. So obviously, this has helped with implementing those controls as well.
So these are fantastic outcomes here, especially in the light of the complexity of the environment that served as the backdrop. And it's great to hear some of those metrics firsthand. Thinking about metrics, actually, I wondered, are there others that come to mind that reinforce this further, or other outcomes that you're looking to measure specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are several metrics in the space that get presented right in our monthly source to pay meetings. So one of them is integration failure versus success, right? So there's a few different reasons why an integration would fail. Obviously, the first one is design. So sharing relationships across ERPs, affiliate partners, you name it, right? So that's a design-related issue, and those can be worked through. We're working through those through the enhancement ticketing process, but also master data, right? So one of the pivots that we made is looking at a light integration where we don't expose all of these changes across every relationship, and that's dramatically improved our integration failures. We may not have solved the master data that caused the issue, but just by not exposing that change to the master data has increased our success rate. At the same time, some of these things that I mentioned that we didn't fully do before we launched, like fixing the master data or fixing the configuration settings, we also take a look at the failures that are occurring in each ERP, figure out the root cause, and then go back and make the configuration changes in ERP, correct the master data gaps, whatever we need to do to reduce those moving forward. One of the challenges with integration failures is that you only see the failure that was related to what you're trying to integrate, right? So we take those failures, bucket them into themes, and then work each one of them as an independent work stream so that we can hopefully mitigate future failures, right? So that's a metric that we report on. Of course, the progress related to our enhancements and tickets, just as a natural course of doing business. And then the other thing is the health and aging of our workflows. So we have a VMCOE team that I'm responsible for, and they interface with the business and they do certain functions with vendor registration and onboarding, right? Including managed tickets. And then there's items that are sitting within Hicks workflows, right? Whether they're internally managed or externally managed. And, there's aging for those items as well for various reasons. Lessons learned and how to report on that and figure out how we can either close tickets that haven't been actioned or remind people to do what they need to do while that workflow is in their box, or to fix any defects that are causing things not to flow. One of the challenges we had there was the response from Exeter, right? So we worked through those issues and forced a lot of those stuck workflows through the system. So we have a full panel that's got about a dozen metrics on it that takes a look at the health of this work stream, right? And some of it's internally facing. How many help desk tickets we have, how many requests we have, what types of requests they were, training issues, right? Things that were rejected, why were they rejected, right? Probably our biggest issue is user error around, global versus local data changes. So things like that.
With these foundations, so seeing the metrics, tracking progress, having that transparency and so on, what's next on your list? Where do you want to take this next, having these foundations now in place?
Well, obviously for all of our work streams right now, since we're through most of our launches, we're looking at stabilization, right? So ensuring that everything is working as intended, going back and adding features that we were not able to do in wave one, right? So one of the big examples for the Hicks work stream would be the ability to block or unblock a vendor. Right now that's happening offline. So, taking a look at opportunities to have better integration and collaboration and self-service, right? That's what this is all about. Also revisiting our internal requirements that made it very complex to register and onboard a supplier, right? Complexity makes things more difficult. So we had to go back and rationalize, do we really need all of this? Does it still make sense? And we've really made some changes to make the end-to-end process a lot easier. So, certainly stabilization and enhancements are two big issues, and the other one is embedment, right? So the more people use the tool on a daily basis, the better that they're going to get at being able to self-serve. And we want to hear from those people as well, to kind of be a conduit of what we could do better and future enhancements. So, that's certainly how I think we're going to spend the next probably year to 18 months, not just in Hicks, but in our other work streams too. In the Ariba space, we've still got a couple things to do that weren't related to GE separation, right? So those took kind of like a backseat to some of the burning platform, but things like direct sourcing and contracts and a true services solution for oil field services. So we've still got a lot of work to do there, downstream sourcing, and Hicks touches all of this, right? because a lot of the data that we collect in this process gets sent to our ERPs and Ariba, and anytime we want to add a feature or change something, we have to take a look at the upfront business processes, including Higgs.
And of course, we spend a lot of time thinking about process efficiencies, but there are also benefits to making these changes from a supplier perspective. What sort of feedback have you had from that side? Are there any anecdotes you could share from this viewpoint?
So I think a lot of our product companies and business partners wanted to start with internally managing the suppliers, right? So we're probably doing a lot more of that than we intended. And some of the difficulty that suppliers would have using the tool are related to governance that we impose in various situations. So, it's one thing to register and onboard a supplier for the first time, right? But we learned very quickly we were expecting suppliers to do things that didn't add a lot of value when we were extending that relationship to, different operating units or legal entities across the geography. So, part of the goal was to take a look at the level of effort it takes to get through the process and rationalize what we can take out because it's not adding value and it's slowing down the process. So it's really work in progress at this point. Part of the stabilization is ensuring that we can use the tool internally and then improve the processes and the integrations and the features that we have, and then roll it out externally where we can.
My final question is now around digital transformation generally, and I wondered, given your experience in the field and your expertise here, what are some of the common mistakes you see being made in this area in the wider arena? I'm just wondering about any advice you might share that could help others here.
So I think underestimating change management is a big one, right? And you've heard that theme before, right? And the other one that I just keep harping on is people always overlook data, no matter what the project is, right? Whether it's material masters, vendor masters, you name it, right? Finance, just taking a look at not only the data that you have, but how you want to structure that data moving forward. I touched on the point that we have so many different ERPs. Just think about the granularity of your chart of accounts, right, between different ERPs and how you reconcile that, at the UNSPSC level or at the GL level or whatever. So data is huge no matter what your business transformation is, and I think a lot of people don't focus enough of their efforts there, right? The other thing is this fallacy that you can go buy some sort of software and it's going to solve all of your problems, right? You need to have the conviction to solve your problems. Some of them are very difficult and painful, and technology is an enabling tool, right? And you can be very successful, but not without having a sound strategy, sound master data, sound governance, and adoption. You can spend $1 billion on the greatest ERP system in the world, and so what if nobody uses it or maintains it, right?
Absolutely. Some fantastic advice for us to end on there. Well, thank you again, Craig, for sharing this insight. And thanks to all of you who could join us for this session today. We hope it was useful, and we hope to see you again soon.